Manchester Chamber. We are going to record today's session. We will share the slides as well afterwards. So please, feel free to take any notes you want, but the slides will be shared. And we will have a Q&A at the end of today's session. So welcome to these bite-sized sessions we run. We try and run these throughout the year and focus. We were focusing on key issues from Brexit. I guess today's session is also focused on the post-Brexit world and how we move people around on the visas and the work permit side. And I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Thomas from IEM Consultancy, who is one of our approved suppliers and works with all our members and non-members as well, who need some support on the visa and work permit side. So Tim's going to do the bulk of today's presentation. We have got quite a few new companies here today, so I'm just going to introduce the Chamber shortly as well, so you're aware of who we are and how we can support you. So like I said, Tim's going to take the bulk of today's session, and then we will, if you could save your questions for the Q&A at the end, we'll leave some time for those. There is a Q&A box at the bottom for those who are familiar with Zoom. If not, it appears in the black bar. You can post in the Q&A chat box or the chat box, and then my colleague Pauline as well will be on today's session managing the questions throughout. So I've already introduced myself, but just for those of you who aren't aware, who is the Chamber? So we are a membership organisation. We've been going for quite a long time. We cover all 10 local authority areas in Greater Manchester. We have also 4,200 members and a business community that we launched in COVID with a further 800 businesses that we support. Key sectors are manufacturing, engineering, property and construction and financial services, but we support companies of all sizes in all sectors. On the international side, we're the second largest team within the Chamber. We basically can help anybody with their import-export journey, those who are looking to set up in the UK or overseas, and we do that through lots of services that we run via our in-house team, and then also lots of services that we run via partners such as Tim, who we have on today's call. So anything from market research to finding customers, distributors, suppliers overseas or in the UK. We run lots of free bite-sized sessions and also more in-depth training courses, which I'll come on to a little bit later on. And we also offer bespoke advice, obviously on the visa side, but also on customs and compliance and documentation side of things. We've got a host of services to help with getting paid and funding. So if anybody's struggling with any of that, please again reach out to the team. We've a large part of our international trade team focuses on the documentation, so anything from certificates of origin, EWA1s, ATA carnets, which are temporary export documents. If you go into exhibitions, or for those of you on the call that are sending engineers overseas and they're taking professional equipment with them or samples, you'll likely need an ATA carnet, and we can help you with that. And then finally, something we launched post-Brexit, our customs clearance. So we can now clear all exports and imports in the UK. And we have access to all ports and airports for the import side. And we do also offer T1 and transit documents. So if you ever get asked for any of them documents, again, I'll pop our contact details up at the end. So just reach out to the team. And our motto is that if we can't answer the question, we'll find somebody like Tim who can answer the question for you. This is just a brief overview of what we've got coming up. So some of our training courses. So we've got things on tariff codes, documentation. I know a couple of you who registered for today's session said you'd like to look at things such as saving duty and duty charges. So that we've got some training courses coming up on those. We've got a workshop on the new customs declaration service, and a new workshop we're launching in February on customs warehousing. And we will have a training course following on from this session talking about visas and work permits in more details. And there at the bottom, we've got Meet the Market Expert, which is a virtual business clinic where you can meet any of our experts and we'll connect you with them, and you can have a one-to-one meeting to talk about international trade strategy. finding customers, finding agents and distributors overseas. So I am shortly going to hand over to Tim, but I just wanted to launch our first poll for today's session. So you should see that pop up on your screen now. So if you could answer it, tick all that apply to you. So do you currently, or do you plan in the next 12 months to do any of the below? So I'll just leave you a minute or so to answer that. It is anonymous. Just really so we can get a focus of who's on today's call and make sure the session is relevant for you. So I'll just give you another 30 seconds to answer. Looks like they're coming in. Okay, and I'm just going to share those results so we can see them and you can see them, Tim. So 38% of people on the call do plan to send UK-based workers to the EU. Another 30% plan to recruit non-UK workers. 8% for your EU clients to send workers to the UK. And then there are around 30% that doesn't apply to on the call. So I will hand it over to you now, Tim. You might just need to close that poll to get it off your screen, Tim, and then you should be able to control the slides.
Thanks, Amy. Today's a bite-sized session. It's not meant to be all-embracing. It's an overview. I haven't included all the detail here. So it's really a quick start guide. If you want to know more, then let's look at the training that the Chamber are offering in the future. And also, if you need more information, get in touch with the Chamber and they can set up a call or answer your quick questions. So very much an overview, and let's have a look at trade and mobility. There's two aspects. This one is people coming into the UK and the other is people going from the UK to the EU. So there's inbound and outbound that we're going to look today. So the first bit is travel to the EU. That's the outbound aspect. Right, working in the EU. So this is about people who are UK employees that travel to provide services in the EU in a variety of situations. It is a common way that UK businesses trade with the EU. They might provide goods, they might be exporting, but also their workers travel from the UK to the EU. And when they do, they are broadly termed service providers. This could be short-term business travel on some occasions, or it could be longer term. And the sorts of reasons for the trips might be in the manufacturing sector. They could be engineers that are repairing, warranty work, installation machinery, project managers. The education sector is a major export of services, lectures, training, etc. Professional services, accountancy and legal, sales and marketing, or IT work. So a range of reasons why UK-based workers may be going to the European Union. We're going to split this into three. We're going to look at who is a business visitor, who's a service provider, and we're going to look at some intra-corporate transfers as well. So business visitors, this is the category that I think most UK businesses would like their workers to be in, largely because it is the easiest category which you can travel to the EU short term to conduct some limited activities. Now, business visitors have a list of what they can and can't do. A word of warning, this list is generic, you see on your screen. It varies country by country. So the whole tenor of today is an overview. Now, if you look down the list, you think, can I do this in France? Can I do it in Germany? Can I do it in Spain or Italy? Then the answer is going to be, you always need to consult the individual rules of that particular country. However, this generic list generally applies to most European Union countries with some regional variations. So what can I do as a business visitor? And a business visitor broadly means I can travel to the EU without a work permit, without a visa, if you are a UK national. So some member states can permit all these activities. Some may permit only some of them, and some may have different activities you can do that's not on the list. So let's look through the generic list, what sort of things that I can do. Meetings, conferences and consultations, not customer facing. Research and design work, researchers only. Some market research, some training seminars. Generally, BV, business visitors, you can receive the training in the form of observation and classroom instruction only. And usually in most European countries, you cannot send your UK-based workers to the EU to receive practical training, vocational training. It's generally classroom only. Trade fairs and exhibitions, attending to promote your products and services. Generally, what you can't engage in is active selling. Sales, representative suppliers can take orders, negotiate sales to existing customers, but you can't deliver on a service contract. Purchasing, you engage in a commercial transaction to purchase goods and services. So a fair amount that you can do as a business visitor. You'll note that in general terms, what you can't do is deliver a service, and you can't engage in client-facing work. So some other permitted activities, generally subject to in-country rules. After sales, after lease servicing. This is a key one. I'll pause for a moment because we've got some manufacturing companies on the call today. The important thing here is you see employed installers and maintainers, emphasis on the word employed as opposed to people that are self-employed. Specialist knowledge essential to the contract. When I talk about the contract, I'm talking about the contract between you, the manufacturer, and your end consumer, the end client in the European Union. This does not work well in subcontracting chains. But you're working then in a warranty or service contract linked to the sale or lease of industrial machinery. So it is a key business visitor exemption, if you like, for the general need for a work permit or a visa. But do look at the wording carefully. Generally, direct contract with the end user, and it's warranty or service work. It potentially doesn't work if you are looking at a long-term service contract. In some instances, we've got are where there is a service contract, which is a standalone service contract, not linked to the sale. That can cause difficulties as well. And each European country tends to have its own particular spin on this. So it is very common for different European countries to place requirements on in terms of time. So sometimes it could be 7 days or 14 days or 28 days or 35 days, whatever it is, within a period of time. But generally, that is a common exemption. Commercial transactions, management, supervisory, financial services, personnel employed in a commercial transaction. Again, that would be a business visitor. Tourism. When you're traveling as a business visitor from the UK to the EU, do remember that when you enter, you are liable to be asked what your reason for travel is and to present some basic proof of that. Most commonly, a letter from your UK organisation explaining where you're going, and a letter from your European client or customer explaining why they've invited you, at the very least. There are others, there are other documents, but those would be two basic common documents that you would expect. Finally, if the activity is not listed, then you'll probably need to consider whether I need a work permit, a visa, or a residence permit. It's not an absolute, because always check the in-country rules, but broadly, if you're doing something that's not on the list on the slides, then we're into a category where we need to apply for some sort of permit. I've used visa, work permit, residence permit interchangeably. They all have distinct and different meanings. Service providers. Well, if I'm not a business visitor broadly, then I'm in the service provider category. Each member state will have different rules. If we're traveling to more than one member state as a service provider, just remember you need to comply with the local rules of each member state. So somewhat frustratingly for the UK and UK businesses, that means that I may need one particular set of documents for France. If I'm going to Germany, even on the same trip, then I need another set of documents for Germany. Broadly, the starting point is to look at your activity and whether the activity triggers the need for a visa or permit. I'm using them interchangeably, they've got different meanings. And bear in mind, it's not the length of time that you're in that country for that matters, it's what you're doing that counts. Now, even within this category, all countries have some useful exemptions from the need to have a visa or a permit. And those exemptions have to be checked locally. There's no quick way around this. And all European countries will have exemptions that apply to manufacturers, for example, or service providers in some case. The exemptions are important to check because if you're in the exemption, that means whilst I'm a service provider, I still generally don't need a visa or permit. I'll need to do something else. There will be a process to follow, but I'm relieved of the biggest obligation, which is to get a visa or permit. Now, if we're not exempt and we're in this category, then we're going to have to apply for the correct document or documentation, remembering you need the correct documentation for each country that you're visiting. So we're already breaking down into a bit of a patchwork. Am I a business visitor? Check the rules for each particular country. We know broadly what we're looking at now. If I'm not in that bucket, then I'm a service provider. Even in the service provider bucket, let's look at what each country will exempt me from doing. If that fails, then I'm looking at some form of permit or visa. Generally, you always need to notify the EU country if you intend to travel. Let's say I'm going to France, for example, and let's say I'm not a business visitor. France, for all the fact they've got very detailed rules, do have some very useful and flexible exemptions from the need for UK nationals to have permits when they go there to work. So that might mean I don't need a work permit to go to France, but I do need to notify them I'm coming beforehand. This is called pre-notification, and this happens almost universally throughout the EU. The pre-notification, how will I do it? Well, it's generally through a web portal link, and it would apply even if I don't need a permit generally. Now, the notification triggers the need to comply with some local labour laws if I'm a service provider. So I'm sending some technicians or engineers over to France. Let's say the activity means that I don't need a work permit. I still need to notify the French I'm coming. And locally on the ground, I need to comply with local labour laws, working time, overtime rates, things like that. Also, I need to provide evidence of social security contributions. And broadly, I'll explain this in a moment, but the basic rule is you only pay social security once. If I can prove that these employees are paying social security contributions in the UK, then subject to process, I don't need to pay it in whatever European country I'm going to, France in my example. Social security rules. Whilst we were a member of the EU, we benefited from several very useful rules on social security coordination. Broadly, this means that UK workers avoid, they don't need to, pay local contributions for the days that they work in the EU. And for this, just for the sake of completeness, the basic rule would be that you pay social security contributions in the place you work, in France, for example. Now, almost all UK workers want to remain paying their national insurance payments in the UK for the days they work in the EU, quite obviously. Now, we can still do this, but we need to follow a process. If we don't follow the process, then UK employers and their workers are liable to pay local national insurance contributions for each day they work in the EU. I mentioned a notification process a moment ago. Generally, that notification process sweeps this up into it. And that means that whatever state you're going to of the EU, they will be checking whether you should be paying local social security contributions as part of that notification process. Usually you can't complete the process without proof that you're paying UK national insurance payments. How do you do this? How do you prove you're paying your NICs in the UK? Well, the proof is obtained from HMRC. It is a certificate. It's called an A1. The A1 is per worker, generally per trip. So rather frustratingly, you need to keep applying for these for each trip, for each worker when they go into the EU. However, if you need some help, contact the Chamber and we can guide you on the process. It's important to apply for the correct form, and some countries want you to provide the form to them, the certificate, to prove that you've paid your national insurance in the UK. Broadly, most or all workers will be entitled to this certificate. So, subject to following the process, we are good to go. We shouldn't generally be paying our social security contributions when we travel into the EU. The last part of this particular section, intra-corporate transferees. Let's imagine that we're part of a larger corporate group. We share common ownership, a number of countries, and one wants to temporarily assign an employee to work in the same group or sister organisation or company based abroad. Now, generally at the time of an application for an ICT permit, the employee will need to reside outside the EU, most obviously the UK in our case, and third country nationals, UK nationals, in other words, for this example, we are bound or have to be bound by an employment contract during the transfer. So providing I'm assigned, providing I'm outside the EU, providing I've got an employment contract, I can apply for an ICT and intra-corporate transfer permit that enables me to be temporarily supplied or seconded from the UK to a sister company in France, for example. I can then go and stay temporarily and work in that EU member state. Each EU member state have different rules for intra-corporate permits. It could be a visa, it could be a permit, depending on the country that I'm visiting. Most are subject to minimum salary thresholds and minimum periods of stay as well. If you think this might apply to you in the future, get in touch and we can go through the individual rules a bit more closely. There are, outside the scope of today's bite-sized session, there are other permits that do allow more flexible work within the EU amongst in a few member states. So you wouldn't just be limited to France in my example. But if it's something that you might be thinking of, please get in touch. So now movement of workers into the UK, broadly the opposite. The slide's got a picture of the EU. These rules broadly apply whether you're coming from the European Union to the UK or anyone else. Since Brexit, we've had one immigration system, which covers all nationalities from wherever they're coming, including the EU, and EU nationals broadly don't get any particular special treatment. Just as I switch the slide, I'm not talking about anyone from the Republic of Ireland today. Broadly, the arrangement that the UK had with the ROI before Brexit has continued, and Irish nationals still have broadly a right to live, work and study in the UK visa-free. So a word about this mechanical process. What is it? Well, this is the process of bringing a skilled worker into the UK. So this is, I have a role that is vacant. I'm struggling to recruit locally. I want to find a candidate in a different part of the world. They don't have a right to work in the UK at the moment. What do I do? Where do I go? Well, the stages are broadly that you as the employer have to have a license. It's called a sponsor license. It's issued by the UK government, stroke the Home Office, stroke UK VI. And you must apply for this sponsor license. I'll explain this in a moment. And you apply through the UK points-based system then to bring the worker in. So the first stage is I've got to have this thing called a sponsor license. The second thing, once I've got my sponsor license, for each worker, I then need to obtain something called a certificate of sponsorship, a COS, otherwise known as a COS, and that's per worker. Finally, once I've got my sponsor license, once I've got my COS for each worker, then each worker will need to apply for a visa to UK VI. They can't apply for the visa until they get this thing called the COS. The COS is not a physical document, It's a virtual document, and essentially it's a barcode or reference number. The COS links you as the sponsor to the individual worker. It provides the bridging link. So 3 steps, a fairly mechanical process. Let's start with this thing called the sponsor license. It is a permission for you, the UK business, to employ a worker who doesn't have an existing right to work in the UK. It's subject to an application process and an application fee. Broadly, £14.76 for a larger business, £5.36 for a smaller business or charity. Small business has the usual definition, which from memory, under 50 employees, and there's turnover and balance sheet requirements as well. It requires a list of supporting documents to apply for this thing called the sponsor license. Typically, your supporting documents will be VAT registration, PAY registration, some audited accounts, insurance, last 3 months bank statements, those sorts of things. They show that you are a legitimate business trading in the UK. You also need a supporting letter that explains a little bit of background, why you're applying, your corporate structure, your hierarchy, those sorts of things. If you're thinking of applying, get in touch, and then we can help with the process, but also with this supporting letter. And the whole process should take around about 4 weeks or so to get your license. And then once you've got your license, you are good to go with the rest of the process. But the first thing is your sponsor license. Before I leave the screen, just bearing in mind, sponsor licenses come in different categories. I'm currently talking about a tier 2 skilled worker. If you're in a slightly different category, if you're in a university, for example, it would be a slightly different category. If you want to bring in intra-corporate transfers, people are part of the same group, different category. If you're bringing in people who are part of a global training program, slightly different category. There's also usefully, I'll say in passing, a different category, but that's for EU nationals coming into the UK who are providing services to UK clients. That's not a category that's particularly well known, but if you've got European clients who need to send their workers over and they need visas, then this fairly new service supplier category can be a very useful route for them to come to the UK to work and supply their services to you. So which route? The UK immigration system is split into what we call tiers. Your sponsor license is linked to your tier. Most businesses are interested in tier 2. There are others. Tier 2 split into highly skilled, global mobility, intra-corporate, but there are others. I've name checked the one that could be useful for EU workers, the service supplier category. The certificate of sponsorship required when you hire non-UK workers, digital. You need it before you apply for your visa as the worker. There is a cost to it, and I'll come to costs in a moment. So each cost costs £199 each time you apply for it. The UK points-based system. So in this category, the skilled worker, the UK has a point system. Points are awarded for different criteria. You broadly need 70 points to qualify for your visa. How do you get your points? On the slide are some examples of how you get your points, but broadly, where do my points come from? I get points from being paid a certain minimum salary. I get points from having a job offer from a UK sponsor. I get points by having education and qualification requirements met. And the points vary according to the route. So I picked this one because it's a popular route for UK employers. And broadly, as you see from the slide, I get a certain number of points for the job offer, a certain number of points for having the appropriate skill level, a certain number of points for my salary, and there are some additional requirements, notably a command of the English language. The English language is subject to a test in some cases, There are some exemptions, but they're quite limited. You take the test wherever you are. Let's assume you're applying out of country, you would take it wherever the local test centre is. And the UK government has test centres throughout the world. And there is a cost to that. The cost typically between 120 and 150 pounds, something in that region. It varies locally. And you have to have this test certificate as part of the visa application. But broadly, those are the requirements for the type of visa that we're talking about today. Salary thresholds. Salary thresholds are or can be variable. There is a general minimum of £25,600 or £10.10 an hour. That's the general threshold, or the going rate for the job. Now, if the going rate for the job is higher than 25,600, then you need to meet the higher of those two amounts. If the going rate for the job is lower than the minimum, 25,600, then you need to meet the 25,600. So it's the higher of whatever these two metrics are. And I've got an example on the slide. Employee 27,000 a year, the going rate's 30, therefore they need to meet the higher rate, the going rate, to qualify for the visa. There are some exemptions from the 25,600. They're quite limited. One is that the job you're recruiting for is on a shortage list, and the UK government maintains a shortage occupation list, an SOL. If it's on the SOL, then essentially you can be paid 80% of the going rate and have a reduced visa fee. Employees under 26, those studying or recent graduates or in professional training, also qualify for a lower rate. So there is a young worker discount essentially that may be worth pursuing for some UK businesses. And the last one is essentially STEM PhDs, which would apply probably in a very limited number of circumstances. So salary thresholds, the UK government maintains tables. The tables are specific to the visa category. I'm in Tier 2 skilled worker. So how do I find out what the salary threshold is? And I look at the Tier 2 skilled worker minimum salary table. Also for Tier 2 skilled worker, I would need to look at the list of jobs that are included in that particular visa route. Not all jobs in the UK economy are in this visa category. So if you're thinking about this as something you might want to do in the future, my tip would be start at the end of the process. Think about the jobs you want to recruit for. Think about the jobs that you might want to fill by non-UK workers that don't have a right to work in the UK. Start by looking at the tables, because if you look through the tables and the jobs you want to recruit for aren't on the list, then applying for the sponsor license, getting this far isn't going to help you, because there have to be a job that's on the list in order for the person to get a visa. So a bit of forward planning before you commit any time or expense to this would pay dividends further down the line. So a recap on salaries for highly skilled workers, 25,600 or the going rate. I briefly mentioned what some exceptions that could be. Global mobility workers, we used to call them intra-corporate transferees, broadly 42,400. In all these things, there's always some gloss around it as well, some changes. They vary according to the going rate. Where do you find the going rate? In the published tables. Each job has a classification number. Tier 2 skilled worker, Tier 2 global mobility, the intra-corporate transferees, they have different going rates and they have different tables of eligible jobs as well. So again, if you're thinking about this today, then have a look at the jobs available for Tier 2 skilled worker, Tier 2 global mobility. Make sure that you're recruiting for one of those eligible jobs before you start. Visas and immigration. So when at the end of the process, how am I going to apply for this visa? I apply online at gov.uk. Make sure that when you get your link, you get the right link, because depending on what visa you're applying for, it will have a different link. So tier 2 skilled worker, one link. Tier 2 global mobility, different link. Migrant workers can apply up to 3 months before they do to start work. The skilled worker visa allows the migrant to come and stay in the UK with the approved employer, with the sponsor license. And just to state, I think what is generally obvious, the sponsoring employer has to be the employer of the individual. So you couldn't have one person with a sponsor license and another person as the employer. The sponsor license holder will be the employer of the worker. What have they got to have? They've got to have this confirmed job offer. They've got to have this thing called this certificate of sponsorship, essentially a reference number. You've got to be paid at least the minimum salary, and that's linked to your job role. There are a couple of other requirements that, given today's a bite-sized session, I've not got into. One is that the visa applicant has to have a minimum amount of money in their bank account for generally 30 days before they apply for their visa. It's a subsistence amount. Visas under the global mobility route have some different requirements. You've got to work for your overseas employer for at least 12 months outside the UK before you apply, and there are different maximum stay limits. Once applied, the decision on the visa should be made within 3 weeks if you're outside the UK. That greatly depends on the degree of demand for visa applications within the system, and the 3 weeks can slip if demand is high. Visitors. So let's look at the visitor route. Broadly in the UK, 2 routes if you come to the UK: the visitor route, the visa route. We've looked at the visa route. Let's look at the visitor route. So we've only got a few exemptions for a general visa requirement to work in the UK, but the UK has visitor rules that allow short-term entry. Short-term generally is 6 months, up to. Key is the visitor is not employed in the UK and intends to leave, and broadly not actively working or working at all in the UK. What can I do under this route? Business meetings, conferences, trade fairs, installation of manufacturers' goods. Some nationalities need a visa. If you're an EU citizen travelling on an EU passport, broadly all those categories of worker do not need a visa to come to the UK. Other nationalities do, and we have essentially a list that is fairly easy to look up to work out whether the person needs a visit visa to come. These are just examples on the slide. There's a lot more detail behind these. And if you think you might be in the visitor category or someone is coming in the visitor category, get in touch and we can provide a bit more information on that. Costs. Again, before you start the process, just be aware of the costs involved. Now, if you're in the category of, I'm thinking about applying for a sponsor license, I'm thinking about sponsoring someone, I'm thinking about filling this position from an overseas worker, what costs are we looking at? Well, we've got our one-off sponsor license fee, £14.76, 5 through 6 if I'm a smaller business or charity. I've got my COS fee, £199 per worker. What are the costs? For each year of the visa, so for each year you're employed with you, the employer has to pay an immigration skills surcharge. That's £1,000 a year, or $364 for small and charitable employers. There are few exemptions from the requirement to pay the £1,000 a year. When you come to actually go through this process, you will see that whilst I've said £1,000 per year, that is just a means of calculation. The actual payment is in one lump up front. So let's assume I'm sponsoring someone to come to the UK from France. They're coming for 5 years. As the employer, at the time that I'm linking the cost to the worker, I'm paying £5,199. That's the 5-year skill surcharge plus the £199 COS fee. you pay it in one lump at that time. You don't pay the £1,000 in blocks each year. So it's quite an expensive process. When you look at it, I've got a lump to pay then. I mean, clearly it's 5,199 split over 5 years. However, be aware you're paying it in one lump at that point. The worker, they will have a visa fee to pay. I've picked one, £12.35 for a 5-year tier 2 visa, but the visa fees vary. Broadly lower fees for a 3-year visa, higher fees for a 5-year visa. The worker also has to pay something called a health surcharge, £6.24 a year. And again, you probably guessed it, when they're applying for their visa, if it's a 5-year visa, they have to pay the 5 times £6.24 when they apply, plus the visa fee, the £12.35. So from a worker's perspective, again, they're paying a fairly hefty charge at the point that they're applying for the visa. However, this is spread over, in my case, 5 years. And employers do not have to. Some employers do pay visa fees and health surcharges. Other employers offer interest-free loans or ways of supporting the worker in those sorts of examples. There are other processing fees for the worker that might apply. Workers from the EU tend not to have additional processing fees. Workers more globally probably will be called to an appointment with a local agent, a visa processing centre, and those appointments do again carry fees with them. And the fees vary globally, but if you had in your mind there's something between £100 and £130 at tops, you wouldn't be too far off. So I've split the cost there: the top costs for you, the employer, the bottom costs for the worker. So we're now on to the Q&A. Hopefully I've finished reasonably on time and covered the material fairly slowly. So we've got UK nationals going to the EU, an overview. We've got some inbound overview. These are very much overview slides, which don't go into a great amount of detail, but hopefully gives you enough to give you a flavour of what you'll be looking to comply with and do if you're looking at inbound or outbound travel.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think that was a really comprehensive overview. I know I've learned quite a bit. We'll open the floor for questions. I think we already have one in the Q&A chat. I don't know if you want to have a look at that, Tim. While you're thinking of your questions, I'm just going to launch a last poll just on the event. Again, don't worry, it's anonymous. So I will leave you to answer that, but you can probably see the Q&A chat at the bottom. We've already got a question. I'm not sure if that has been answered throughout the presentation, but can you see that, Tim?
I can't. Where is my
So what is the difference between defined COS and COS, especially for foreign nationals, is the question.
Where's my chat?
Can you see it at the bottom of your screen on the where your mute and video button is?
Not greatly, I'm afraid.
I can read them to you then. That's fine.
Yeah, if you could. Apologies, I can't.
No worries. No worries. So this first question was, what is the difference between defined COS and COS, especially for foreign nationals?
Yeah, so okay, I'm just going to flick to see if I can actually get the chat up on my screen.
I'm just going to end this poll now. I think we just got a couple more.
Yeah, I'm trying to flick. So defined COS. Two types of COS, defined and undefined. The defined COS is used for those that are applying to come to the UK from outside the UK. If you're on the SMS system, the sponsor management system, you will find, from memory, it's under the workers tab, a specific place to apply for a defined COS. When you come to apply for your defined COS, bear in mind that you will be asked for some additional information. And so broadly, at the time you apply for the defined cost, you will be asked, have you identified a specific individual? Who are they? What is the job code? Information such as that, the proposed salary. So applying for the defined cost, essentially you can only procedurally do that once you have actually found a candidate. That's the defined route. The undefined route essentially is you're recruiting someone who is already in the UK. That's the worker that you've got. From the defined route, essentially you apply as you go along. So you can only apply for those that essentially you have positions for, you found workers for. For the undefined route, workers in the UK, then you can apply more easily for blocks of these COSs. And the blocks just sits there and you just pick one off as and when you want to use it. So applying for the right COS, defined or undefined, is key to the process. The important thing is the worker you're looking to recruit, are they inside the UK or are they outside the UK?
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question. We've got a question from Patricia. We have been granted a skilled workers license. When do we apply for the COS?
So just repeating what I've already said, are you applying for defined or undefined COS? Let's assume that you've gone through this process because you want to apply for someone who is coming to you from outside the UK. Apply for the defined COS as soon as you have a worker you've identified for the position. That is because the application process is going to ask you for some information about them. What you can't essentially do within the process is apply speculatively for your defined COS. What I would say is as soon as you have identified someone, even if you're still in the recruitment process, broadly defined, please apply the defined COS as soon as you are able to, because the defined COS can take some time to come through, and you don't want to be in a position where essentially you've completed the recruitment process, you've made your job offer subject to them having the right to work in the UK, and then the individual is waiting to start and you don't have the COS, they can't apply for the visa because you don't have the COS number. So the answer is as soon as possible. And if you want to know more about the process, get in touch.
Perfect, thank you. And a question from Ian. Hi Tim, you mentioned newly qualified and PhDs. What about people who are neither MSCs or chartered engineers, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that from memory I mentioned in the context of the reduced salary threshold. I'm afraid it's PhDs, and it's PhD, and you've got a PhD that is relevant to your role. It's kind of a link to the role. You can't just have a general PhD and come in to do a different role. That only helps if you're reducing the salary threshold for the work. So unfortunately, the answer to the question is that's not going to help you. However, what I would say is always check the salary thresholds carefully. If you're thinking, well, I've got someone that's borderline, is there a way of reducing it? Have a little think about the under 26 category, the younger worker, and have a think whether the role you're trying to fill is on the shortage occupation list. Look at those potential categories. Otherwise, we're back to the 25,600 or the going rate.
Thank you. Patricia, again, we are employing a colleague from Japan. So if I understand correctly, we must apply for the COS before he can apply for his visa.
Correct. Can you just read the question out again? Apologies, I can't see it in the chat.
Just this question, not the one from earlier, yeah?
No, just the question. The Japanese.
Yeah, so we are applying a colleague from Japan. So if I understand correctly, we must apply for the COS before he can apply for his visa.
Yes. So a brief question. I'm just picking up on the word colleague. That's to me, could be wrong, that to me implies that this is an intra-corporate transfer, now called global mobility. You do need the COS, but if I'm picking up on the question correctly, if it's at intra-corporate, then you need global mobility as your sponsor license. Then you need the COS, then they can apply. You also said Japan, probably would need some more detail, but if you needed some help, then get in touch, because for Japanese nationals, we do have some slight derogations in the rules here and there, which are worth being made aware of. But broadly, yes, you're right. you've got to have the cars before you apply for the visa.
Thank you. And then we've got a comment from Bash about the processes being expensive and we can outsource to remote workers. I know there are different rules for remote workers. I don't know if you know anything about that, Tim, and whether taxation things still apply.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we mean by remote workers. I mean, potentially what we're talking about are workers who are outside the UK, but essentially their role involves work in the UK. If they're not physically in the UK, then broadly we are out with our visa system. So remote working is a way that the individual could provide whatever role or service that they are in the context of the UK labour market. They might want to come over as visitors. Just to be careful, because at the point that you are essentially performing that role in the UK, I mean, and performing it for a UK employer particularly, then at that point you are almost certainly triggering the requirement for a UK visa. Just to be careful, I think the message is there.
Thank you. And now I think that's all we've got coming. So what we will wrap up this session shortly. I'm just going to, our next session with Tim will be slightly longer and more in-depth session, actual training course on the visa and the work permit side. All attendees of today will get 10% discount. I'll send you the full details with all the content. If anybody would like a one-to-one session with Tim, I will follow up today, so you'll have my email address, so please just reach out to me and I can connect you with Tim and the team to help you with that side of things. So if you're looking for some more bespoke, or you've got some technical questions that we didn't cover today, please do reach out to us. I'm just going to put our details up here. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook. Our email addresses are there and phone numbers. And yes, a recording will be shared as well as a PDF copy of the slides. So we'll just get the recording uploaded to our YouTube channel and then we will share it with you once ready. But I don't think we've got any more questions that have come in. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to Tim for your support and delivering today's session, and to Pauline, who's in the background, who's been helping on the technical side. And please do get in touch and reach out if there's anything, not just on the visa side, anything else that we can support with at the Chamber. Please reach out to the team on those email addresses. But thanks for joining us, and hopefully see you again soon.